It was 2011, and I was sitting down within the confines of 4 blank walls. I had my laptop with me, and I was studying poverty experts, scholarly journals. After a few hours, I started to get a little restless. My eyes started hurting. My head started hurting. So I decided to go and socialize. I went to a plaza in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. And as I was waiting for my friends there was something that stuck to me that day, to this day. I remember seeing 2 children, a boy and a girl around the ages of 6 and 8, respectively, walking with a portable radio, and I could already tell they came from humble origins. Why? Well, because of the way they were dressed, I could tell that they came from the highlands of Bolivia. Well, I was watching. What were they doing with their radio? As they plant it down, they start dancing to Andean music. I thought it was cute. But then what I saw angered me. Adults, adolescents started passing by, laughing, throwing coins, ridiculing them. I saw a stretched limo pass by. Adolescent girls popping their heads out, pointing, laughing hysterically. And I automatically connected the dots. They were ridiculing the children. Why? That angered me. I thought, why are these people like this? But what made me think more than that was the fact that the children were practically unaltered, immune to this ridicule, as if it was their social role in society. As they walk off, as if nothing had happened, they go to the corner of the plaza and they hand the little money that they had earned to their mother. That night I could not sleep. But let's backtrack a few years back when I was growing up in La Paz, Bolivia. I was about 10 years old and the car stops. I turn my head. I see children in the corner. And what I saw angered me as well. They were squandering, trying to find food in the middle of the rubbish. Because they were hungry, I thought. But why? Why am I in a position of privilege while these children that look like me, these children that think like me, they have emotions like me, were suffering? I could not conceptualize the idea of inequality, the idea of social injustice. Fast forward a few years later, and I began to study more formally the issue of poverty. Understanding the abstract concept that poverty really is. And I began to wonder, well, what do children actually think about their own poverty? What do children think about poverty? What are their perceptions? So, you probably have an idea in mind. You probably have, more specifically, an image that pops up to your head whenever you think of poverty. It's probably something like this. It's probably an image of people under extreme poverty that are lacking the essential material resources to have an acceptable living standard, to be able to live under adequate housing, to be able to have access to health care or quality education. This is what experts call absolute poverty, and this is how they measure poverty, by establishing an income threshold, and if you don't attain that line, you are under extreme poverty. For instance, you probably heard of the World Bank. They have the $1 per day income threshold. Now it's gone up to some change, $1 and some change, but you get the idea. Well, poverty is a little deeper than that. So then I started discovering more about other ways that poverty is defined. I saw that experts and policymakers use the definition and measurements of relative poverty, another income threshold of an individual whose income falls below a line that is relative to an acceptable living standard in his or her own society or country. Okay, I thought, that sounds a little more specific, but that's not enough. Poverty is still more complicated than that. I thought poverty is more multidimensional. So to be fair, I began to read literature out there that experts have begun to study more multidimensional ways to define poverty. For instance, in South Africa, where child poverty is a problem, a significant problem, studies have been conducted on multiple indicators of low living standards. And British researchers have been developing multiple deprivation standards, where if the person is deprived of core living standards, such as a job, if you're deprived of healthcare access, deprived of quality education, then you are a person in a disadvantaged position in society. Well, that sounds more like it, I thought, right? It sounds more like poverty deals with more factors, and poverty is more multidimensional, and I still did not feel that this was enough. Why? Well, because experts are defining poverty still. What about ordinary citizens? What about their views? Shouldn't we take their views into account? Well, to be fair, again, I saw research that started emerging around a decade or so ago, again by British researchers, that talks about the socially perceived necessities approach, which refers to individuals are being interviewed or surveyed that talk about the necessities that they feel they need in order to hold an acceptable standard of living in their society. Great, I thought. This is what we need in our research. But wait a minute. What about children? What about their views? What about their perceptions? I could not find much info on that. So I started reading more. I started digging, and I saw that children's broader views are really represented just through social work assessments or psychological evaluations, legal representation, or even through their parents, but not through them. Okay, I thought, I need to look into all of the research related to child poverty and to see which studies actually deal with children's perceptions of poverty. So, I went through 2,400 different studies that dealt with child poverty, and this is the retrieval and the condensation process, which was a systematic retrieval process that I went through. You don't have to read that. You don't have to preoccupy yourself with that. It's mainly, I want to share that with you because my eyes, my brain was hurting for over a month, and my trials and tribulations were quite high, and I'm passionate about this. I just want to share that with you. However, what I found out after this troubling process of trying to find these studies is that there are only 10 adequate studies out of the 2,400 that dealt indirectly or directly to child poverty, that had actual transcripts and interviews and qualitative research that had to do with children's perceptions of poverty. Only 10. Just think about it. How are policymakers going to be able to implement informed social policies that target child poverty if their research is not there? Okay, so what I started finding through those 10 studies, and I wanted, moreover, to see, do children hold similarities or differences across different national and cultural contexts. So these studies spanned over 7 different countries: in Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, South Africa, then Vietnam, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia, and India, and the United States. So I started to go over the overarching themes that I found, and the realization that children can actually articulate poverty rather well from varying ages, as young as 6 all the way to adolescence. And they could talk about the causes of poverty, they could talk about the consequences of poverty, and even how to alleviate poverty. So I had 3 themes that emerged out of my research that were more pronounced. And these were causes of poverty, consequences, and alleviation again. So under causes of poverty, children were able to talk about individual behavior in some of the studies. For instance, bad spending habits, negative behavior, or even lack of effort, if you will. Sometimes we call it laziness. However, more pronounced was the concept of unemployment. Unemployment directly correlates to poverty. And this was present in every single study. Children knew about this correlation quite well. However, more interestingly, I saw the intergenerational disadvantage, where children understood, well, if I am born poor, and if my parents were poor, and if my great-grandparents were poor, and so on, then I will probably be poor for the rest of my life. That's an intergenerational disadvantage. And what about the family's role? What about explicitly the parents' role? What about their negative behaviors? Well, children talked about that also influencing their own poverty. And as far as consequences of poverty, that's a more emotionally felt concept. For instance, shame and humiliation is a consequence of poverty. Children talked about this quite well, and it was a very heartfelt interview. When I was reading and imagining how the children were talking about this, it was quite profound. For instance, a child in Uganda talked about how he endured mental suffering because he was poor, and he felt shame and humiliation in his own society because he felt unloved and even despised in his own society. Our child articulated that. What about gender inequality? Perhaps not talked about in that terminology, but children would talk about, for instance, premature young girls getting married to get out of poverty. Or educational issues, the fact that some of them had to work, or the fact that some didn't have enough resources to go to school for books, for pencils, laptops. Children talked about that. And to a lesser extent, but still present in the research, was environmental and health issues. For example, within the environmental issues, children talking about how unsafe their environs were within the communities that there were. That the poorer the community is, the more unsafe it is. Or not being able to go to a doctor, not having healthcare access, not being able to have adequate food, so they were malnourished because of poverty. And alleviating poverty, children talked about government support, more specifically providing a better quality education, higher quality, and that can actually reduce poverty. Another less pronounced concept, but that children actually talked about, perhaps they did not know that this was about social change, but they would discuss the concept nonetheless, was social change. For instance, in the United States, children that were interviewed in a middle school talked about how the American culture ought to be more philanthropic. Well, that is social change. And again, employment, a very a very important concept that children understood, directly correlated to reducing poverty. Well, if someone is employed, they make money, so they might be less poor, children said. So, looking at the differences and similarities of children's perceptions, I actually found more profound similarities. And the differences that were there related to employment, education, unemployment. If that rings a bell, it's because those were discussed by children across national settings. So they were still, in that sense, a similarity. They might have disagreed in how those relate to poverty, but they still related those to poverty. And then the similarities with shame and humiliation, again, being a very heartfelt, a strong concept that children understood. And the fact that if they're born poor, they might stay poor, or their parents might have a role in their own poverty. Okay. Great, right? So what? I know more about children's perceptions of poverty. And how can we actually use this information? How is this going to better their lives? Well, just the why question, just think. If you were a person that could conceptualize and define your own destitution in society, at varying degrees, but conceptualize and define it nonetheless, and someone else was in a position, a full authority that defined and addressed these issues for you, you might think that you ought to have a say in the equation. Perhaps it's not fully unfair, right? So there's hope. It's not all negative. The United Nations enacted the Convention on the Rights of the Child back in 1989, and since then has been the most widely ratified convention in the world, a human rights convention specifically, where they call for children's participatory rights to have a say in issues that deal with their own well-being. Well, that's a great idea, right? They should have a say as well. But there's more work to do. The research is paramount to inform policymakers worldwide how to incorporate children's own perceptions of poverty when implementing social policies, so we can have a more robust framework to present to our policymakers and decision makers. So I'll leave you with this thought. The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. Please don't forget that, and thank you.